Imagine automating your entire AWS infrastructure with just a few clicks. This video is going to be the first one in a series on how to build a powerful CI/CD pipeline and use it to automate the deployments of your infrastructure and your front-end web application. In today's video, we're going to focus on the first half where we build the CI/CD pipeline that deploys our AWS CDK infrastructure using AWS Code Pipeline. No more manual updates, no more misconfigurations, just seamless automated deployments. Let's dive in and transform the way you manage your infrastructure. Hi, if you're new around here, my name is Ryan. I'm an AWS certified solutions architect and developer, and my goal is to teach you modern serverless system design using AWS. Let's jump in. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to build today. So I have it outlined here, but basically we're going to build a very simple code pipeline that deploys some CDK infrastructure to our AWS account. So we're going to build this repository here. Inside of this repository, we're actually going to have two separate CDK projects, and we'll kind of explain what's going to go into each one. So the first one is going to be our pipeline source. This is where we're going to house all of our code pipeline code, as well as our artifacts bucket for all of the artifacts that the code pipeline is going to generate. When we deploy this code pipeline, it's going to have two stages, a source stage and a deploy stage. The source stage is going to pull from this repository, and then the deploy stage is then going to deploy whatever infrastructure we put into this second CDK project called infrastructure source. So the point of putting everything involving the code pipeline into this first folder is because it's meant to only be deployed once. We're going to deploy it using the command line, and then once this pipeline is up and running, anything that we would want to add is going to go into our second folder, which is going to be our infrastructure. In our case, it's just going to be an S3 bucket. However, the point of this infrastructure folder is meant to house any serverless infrastructure that you would want to build for maybe a front-end web application. So your API gateway, your Lambda function, your DynamoDB table, basically things that are going to be changing more frequently than the code pipeline itself. And then any changes that get pushed to this repository will then pull from this infrastructure source, and then we'll just automatically deploy it. In part 2 of this video, we're actually going to expand the pipeline to deploy a front-end web application built with Vue. And we'll definitely get a chance to see how this works once we get done building it. All right, so let's hop into the code and start building. All right, let's create our main folder. We'll call it CDK-CI-CD-pipeline. Next, we're going to make our two CDK project folders. The first one is just going to be called pipeline, and the second one will just be called infrastructure. Now we'll CD into the pipeline folder that we created inside of this main folder, and we'll just CDK init app-l TypeScript and init our first CDK project. Perfect. All right, the first thing we're going to do is open up cdk.json, and we're going to declare some context variables that we can use in our pipeline. The first is going to be our infrastructure repo name, and that's just going to be named whatever we called this parent folder here. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to declare repository owner. In this case, it's Cloudmancer Media. It's just my GitHub username. Just keep in mind that it is case sensitive if you're using GitHub. Next thing we're going to declare is a dev and a prod object. These will just contain our environment specific variables that we're going to need when we go to deploy each of our individual dev and prod pipelines. All right, it's just going to have two values in it right now. It'll just be the env name, which is of course just dev and prod, and then the branch name for the branch that the code pipeline will be pulling from every time it deploys. So anytime we push something to either dev or prod, it will trigger the respective pipeline. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to open up bin, and we're going to go to this pipeline.ts file. We'll clean this up and get rid of all this extra text. Great, so that looks good to me. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're just gonna create a little environments array here that's just gonna have dev and prod. Next, we're gonna try to get the deploy environment, and the deploy environment is going to try get context of an env variable. You can see that there is no env key in here. So what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna set it up to supply this at deploy time, and then that value will then get propagated down into the different stages of the pipeline. This is really gonna allow us to create a truly environment specific redeployable pipeline. And if you wanted to add more stages, you could obviously add like stage in here or test or whatever you want, and then just supply that value at deploy time, which we'll do in a few minutes here. We're just going to put a little error handling in here, and we're just going to check to make sure deploy environment is declared. And we're also going to make sure that the value that's declared is part of this array. If it's not, we're just going to throw an error here that's just going to remind the person who's deploying to make sure that they supply this env context key. All right, next we're going to let env equal app.node.tryGetContext of whatever deploy environment we passed in. So if we pass in dev, then it's going to pull this respective context object that has the env name and the infrastructure branch name. So we can then pass that down into the code pipeline. All right, let's get our last two context variables that we're going to need for this part of the pipeline, and that's going to be the infrastructure repo name that we set here and the repository owner from GitHub. Great, so we're just going to then take that env object that we set up here, and then we're also going to pass in the infrastructure repo name, repository owner, and then we're also just going to pass in a description. All right, last thing that we're going to do do is we're going to take this deploy environment and we're going to pass it into the name of the stack. Stacks have to have unique names. And finally, we'll pass in the env object. Let's go ahead into lib and open up our pipeline stack. In here, we'll just destructure and import stack and stack props. We'll delete SQS as well as this commented code right here. All right, and we'll start by creating our own interface for the stack props. So we have env name, infrastructure repo name, infrastructure branch name, and repository owner from GitHub. We'll then set our stack props to pipeline stack props here, and we'll remove the question mark because it's always going to be passed in our case. Okay, first we'll just console.log props so we can confirm that it's either dev or prod that's being passed into the creation of the stack. Next, we're going to destructure from props all of these values that we're going to need. All right, so now since we're going to be sourcing this repository from GitHub where I have it hosted, we're going to jump on over to GitHub and I'm going to show you how to create a GitHub token. Let's jump over and do that now. All right, so what you're going to do is just click on your little profile here. Click on settings. If you scroll down here a little bit, you can go to developer settings, click on the little caret here and click on tokens classic. Here, you're just going to create generate new token. And then in the scopes of the token, you're going to declare the admin repo underscore hook and repo. It's going to generate you a token and then make sure you take the token and save it somewhere because you won't be able to see it again once it goes off this screen. So now we need to take our token and store it somewhere securely within AWS so it can be accessed by the code pipeline. We're just going to use Secrets Manager for this because it's one of the great things that it's designed for. So all you're going to do is type AWS Secrets Manager, create -secret --name, and then the name of your token, which in our case is just going to be GitHub -token. And then finally --secret -string, and then your token value just in parentheses. This is going to create a Secrets Manager entry called GitHub -token, and then we can reference it in our CDK code. So we're just going to say const GitHub token is equal to secret value. We'll import that automatically. Dot Secrets Manager, and then we're going to pass in just the name of our secret, which is just GitHub token. Next, we're going to define our infrastructure deploy role. This deploy role needs to be assumable by both code build and code pipeline. All that we're going to do is grant the ability for all of the CDK roles that get created when you bootstrap your account to be assumed by code build and code pipeline. So we're just going to do a new role and import that from IAM. We'll call it the infrastructure deploy role and we'll pass in this as the context. Next, we'll do assumed by. Will be assumed by a new composite principal. The reason we use that is because it's going to need to be assumed by both code pipeline and code build. So we'll do a new service principal and we'll pass in codebuild.amazonaws.com and we'll do the same for code pipeline. Now we'll define the policy that will define the permissions that these services will be granted when they assume this role. So to do that, we'll just do inline policies. Inline policies is an object. We can name the key whatever we want. We'll just call it CDK deploy permissions. And that will be a new policy document where we'll pass in an object. That object will have a key called statements. Statements will just be an array, and this array will just include one policy statement. So we'll do new policy statement. Again, we'll pass another object into policy statement here, and that will include actions, which will just be an array of strings, as well as resources. That will also be an array of strings. Now the action is going to be STS assume role. We'll set resources just equal to this single ARN, and it will be a wildcard for any roles that are prefixed with CDK dash. Bootstrapping creates maybe like 4 or 5 roles, and depending on how complex your infrastructure is in the infrastructure folder when it goes to deploy, you could potentially need all of them. So we'll just do a wildcard here so it can assume anyone that it needs in any given deployment. Great, so there's our role defined. Next, we're going to create our pipeline artifacts bucket. We'll set this equal to a new S3 bucket. We'll pass in this. Its logical resource name will just be artifact bucket. And then here we'll pass in a few things. The first thing will be the bucket name. Because bucket names have to be globally unique, we're going to also pass in the env name here that we pass into the stack. This will ensure that we have both a dev and a prod artifacts bucket for each of our corresponding pipelines. The next things that we're going to declare here are a couple of things that are optional. The first is removal policy, which we'll just set to removal policy.destroy. And then the second one is going to be auto delete objects, which we're going to set to true. By default, buckets are retained when stacks are deleted. In my case, I will probably go and destroy these stacks after I deploy them. So if this is going to be a more permanent pipeline for you, you might want to skip these. All right, so that should be everything that's not the pipeline pipeline. So now we can start building all the things that'll be actually used by our code pipeline. The first thing we'll do is we'll create our infrastructure source output, and this will just be set to a new artifact, and we'll just name it infrastructure source output. This artifact will just go into that bucket that we created, and it will be used by the code pipeline to reference in subsequent stages. Next, we're going to create an infrastructure build project. So we'll set this equal to a new pipeline project, and we'll pass in this. We'll call this infrastructure project, and then we're going to pass in a number of different things into this. All right, and the first thing we're going to declare here is role. We're going to set that role to our infrastructure deploy role. Next, we're going to define the build environment for our code build project. So we'll set environment will be an object where we will declare build image. Build image is just going to be a Linux build image. So we'll import that dot Amazon Linux 2.5. Next, we'll declare our environment variables, and we're going to set deploy environment equal to the value of the environment name that we're deploying. This will allow the dev or the prod key to be passed down into this project and then subsequently be used to CDK deploy our infrastructure to the correct environment. Finally, build spec. Build spec will import build spec dot from object, where we will pass in an object. We'll declare version 0.2, and then we're going to declare our phases of our build. In phases, we can define the different phases where different commands will be run in a specific order every time our project is built. So we're only going to need both the install and the build phase here, but you also have pre-build and post-build as well. So we'll set install. Install, we're just going to declare runtime version, and we're going to set it to node 20. Then we're going to define all the commands we want to run in this particular phase of the build. In our case, we're going to install the CDK. We're going to CD into the infrastructure folder, and then we're going to npm install all of our dependencies that we need. Our second phase is going to be the build phase, and this will just contain one command, and that's just going to be CDK deploy, and then we're going to set the context variable to be whatever env we pass down into this pipeline. All right, so there's our infrastructure build project. Now let's actually define the pipeline itself. We'll do const pipeline is equal to new pipeline. We'll import that from code pipeline. We'll pass in this as the context. We'll refer to it just as CI pipeline. Then we're going to pass in a few things. Of course, we're going to need to give a unique name to the pipeline, and we're going to call it the env name -ci pipeline. We're going to also give it the infrastructure deploy role. This will allow the pipeline and the build project to assume whatever roles are necessary in order to deploy our CDK infrastructure. And then we're also going to pass in our artifact bucket so that the pipeline knows to use this bucket to store all of its pipeline artifacts. All right, now that we've defined the pipeline itself, we're going to add our two different stages. So we're going to do pipeline.add stage. Add stage is going to take in an object. For our first stage, this is of course going to be our source stage that's going to source from our GitHub repository. Next, we're going to define actions. Actions is going to be set to an array. This stage is only going to have one action for now, and it's just going to be a GitHub source action. So we'll do new GitHub source action, and into this we'll pass an object. We're going to pass in owner as repository owner and repo as infrastructure repo name that we passed in from our context values earlier. We'll define the action name as infrastructure source. We'll declare what branch we want it to pull from, which in our case is just going to be the infrastructure branch name. So either dev or prod. Actually, I just realized we should probably not set this to prod. Maybe we should just call this main instead. That's better. So now this infrastructure branch is going to pull from either dev or main. Next, our output is going to be our infrastructure source output that we defined earlier. And finally, we'll declare our OAuth token. This will just be the GitHub token that we stored in Secrets Manager a little bit ago. All right, so our source stage has been defined. Next, we're going to add our deploy stage. So we'll do pipeline.add stage once again, pass in an object. We'll refer to stage name as just deploy. And in our actions here, we'll just declare another array. And again, we're just going to have a single action here, but this time we're going to call it a code build action. Now, you might wonder why this stage is called deploy, but we're using code build. And this is due to the fact that there are pretty limited constructs in the CDK available for deploying things that don't involve either deploying to an ECS container or to an EC2 instance. And in our case, we're just going to be running CDK deploy. So code build works for us. We'll define the action name as deploy CDK infrastructure. We'll pass in the project as our infrastructure build project that we defined with our build spec. Our input is simply going to reference the output of our previous stage of source, which is the infrastructure source output. And we'll once again assign our role of infrastructure deploy role. All right, so that finishes our pipeline definition. So let's just go over really quickly and we'll define our infrastructure project that'll be deployed by our pipeline. If you're getting value from this video, please don't forget to like the video and please let me know down in the comments if there's any other things that you want to see me make on this channel. So we'll CD out of this into infrastructure and we'll once again CDK init app-l TypeScript. Again, we'll destructure app here, clean up all of this commented code. And in here, the first first thing we're going to do is we're going to check to make sure that deploy environment is defined, because we're going to need it when we go to deploy the infrastructure itself. If you remember over here in our pipeline, we declared deploy environment and we set it equal to the env name of whatever it is when we actually deploy our pipeline. So next we'll destructure it here and we'll rename our infrastructure stack to be environment specific with either dev or prod. And then we'll pass the deploy environment here into the stack as well as a description. It's going to yell at us because we actually need to go create an interface like we did for our pipeline. So we'll open up the infrastructure stack here. We'll delete all of this commented code. We'll destructure stack and stack props and delete these here. Just like with the pipeline, we'll create an interface that extends the stack props. We'll change the name of the props here and get rid of the question mark because we're always going to be passing this in. Next, we'll destructure the deploy environment so we can use it in our bucket name. We'll just log this so we can see which deploy environment is being detected. Finally, we'll declare infrastructure bucket is just equal to a new bucket. Pass this. We'll call its logical resource name infrastructure bucket. We'll pass in the bucket name here. Again, the bucket needs to be unique, which is why we're going to pass deploy environment into the name. We'll also declare removal policy destroy on this one. Since we're not actually putting anything into this bucket, we don't need to do the auto delete objects. Great, so we finished our infrastructure stack. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a main branch and a dev branch, and in our case they're just going to be equal, but we're going to push those to our GitHub repository. Great, so we've pushed both our dev and our main branches to source. So we're actually ready to go ahead and deploy the pipeline itself now. And the pipeline should pull all of our new changes that we just made to create our infrastructure bucket. And we're going to CDK deploy -- profile Cloudmancer. If you don't know what profiles are, you can check out this video that I did on them a few weeks ago. Then -- context env equals prod. Again, remember these pipelines, once they're finished, are meant to be deployed really only one time. We'll confirm yes, and we'll wait for that to deploy. All right, so that's finished. So let's go check out our prod pipeline real quick. All right, so we can see that our stack was created here. We'll hop over here into our pipeline and we can see that our execution is in progress. So if we open that up, we can see our 2 stages that we defined of source, which here you can see it just pulled from GitHub on the main branch. Now it's going through the deploy process here. That's deploying a second CloudFormation stack that will deploy our infrastructure bucket that we defined. We can actually jump here into S3 and we can see 2 buckets. We see the code pipeline artifacts bucket that we created for the pipeline, and we can see our prod infrastructure bucket that was created by the second CloudFormation stack that was deployed by the pipeline itself. And we can actually go confirm that here too, and we can see that we have 2 stacks that were created. One was the pipeline itself, and one was the infrastructure stack deployed by the pipeline. Great, so let's try it out with dev now. And we can see here that it's pulling the correct context variables. We'll confirm yes. There was actually something that I forgot to mention here, but here in the CDK JSON, there is one context variable that you will have to set. The way that this repository is set up is it's meant for the pipeline context to house all of your context and environment variables. However, in the cdk.json of your infrastructure project, you do need to set this require approval to never. And the reason for that is because when I deployed, by default, the CDK will ask you to confirm changes. And the main reason for this is security issues, because a lot of times the CDK will deploy things into IAM, like roles and policies and stuff like that. And by default, it wants you to confirm that it's allowed to create these things. We can actually change that by setting require approval to never. And we have to do that in the infrastructure because in the build project, you saw there was no way for us to confirm anything. So just a little side note that I wanted to mention. Great. So our second pipeline stack was created. We hop over here into code pipeline and we can see we have a second pipeline for dev now. And we can see real-time logs being updated of all the different commands and things that are happening inside of the build project. Great. Everything installed. Now we're running the CDK deploy again with the context of env set to dev this time, and it's creating our S3 bucket. Go check our S3 buckets and we can see we've now got the artifact bucket for our dev pipeline as well as our infrastructure bucket that was created. And we can see that stack was created as well. So that finishes part 1 of the video where we build the first half of the pipeline. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to add a Vue application and add it to source, as well as build it and then deploy it to S3 with a CloudFront distribution, an SSL certificate, a hosted zone, and we're even going to use a custom domain name. Thanks for watching the video. I'll catch you guys in part 2. Please let me know down in the comments if there's any other videos that you want to see me make, and don't forget to like the video.